Hey, how's everybody doing today? I hope you're all doing well. Um, Part of this course, as I've discussed previously, is that with the study of the environment, ultimately, um, there are laws that are put into place to protect the environment. You may be on the side of this as far as advocating for certain laws, enforcing certain laws if you choose the environment as a career. So I just wanted to touch briefly on this topic, just so you at least know kind of the basics as far as some of the history and some of the background on how policies and laws have been made in the past and how they affect what we see, um, not only in the past, what we saw in the past as far as the environment, but what we see today. So we will look into the rationale for underlying environmental policy throughout the last 200 years, and we'll understand why that changed in the 1980s. Some of the terms that you'll look into as far as affecting environmental policy, free riders are one, conflicts of interest, market capitalism, lobbyists, as far as some of these challenges. Now, I will begin this by saying I profusely apologize in that this view is one that applies to the United States and also, very ashamedly, is looked at from the side of, or from the view of, the Europeans that came here, and it discounts or leaves out the Native Americans, the natives that were already here, the people that were here for, tens of thousands of years before the first Europeans even got here. So I do apologize for that shortcoming. This is how the book treats it, and this is how I'm going to approach it. And to be kind of cynical about it, it's because, you know, as Europeans, when we first got here and we kind of started screwing things up, it wasn't the Native Americans' problems that caused the issues that we're having today. So anyway, all right, I'm going to go ahead and get started. Now, as far as, in science, we investigate different questions about how the natural world works. Now, with the environment, we can ask those questions as well to discover how the natural world works. But what we're looking at here in the next two slides is, how an environmental scientist, how an environmental biologist then remediates environmental problems, issues in the environment. And you have 5 stages of this. Dog's going to start barking again. I'm really, really sorry. A step before step number 1 is that, someone might notice a problem in the environment, and it can be, or a lot of times I should say, it's just by non-scientists who observe a problem that is going on. And then we get to step 1. It's identified as a problem. Environmental scientists kind of swoop in and they identify the problem, and they set up some sort of an experiment, and they test the problem just to find out what is going on. And you see the example there as far as, if somebody notices that fish are dying, it would be the scientists who would test or design an experiment and test a hypothesis to find out. And the example is that there's more bacteria in the lake that is causing that problem. They'll also determine, the environmental scientists will determine, what would happen if nothing is done, what they say the risk analysis, and they will then start to initiate and engage with the public as well as organizations as far as how to implement those particular solutions to that problem. And then what will happen is that in order for many environmental issues, in order for these to be resolved, you do have to have laws and legislations put into place. So for step 4, you have political action that takes place, laws that have to be made, and that can include the public that then encourages that these laws are made. And then the environmental scientists will continue to monitor the problem or revisit that issue and make sure that that problem is resolved. Public policy, of course, just in any situation, is those laws that are put into place that address those issues or concerns that deal with the public. Come on, can you stop barking, please? Out, out, out. Sorry, guys. Sorry, public. Sorry, people. Environmental policy, of course, is specific to the environment. And those particular policies, one might say, well, this is easy enough. I mean, the environmental scientists have drawn these conclusions, and here is the data. And, ideally, wouldn't it then be that the politicians look at the data and the recommendation of environmental scientists and say, okay, well, then we'll do that. No, rarely is that the case. What happens is you have some sort of a compromise that occurs between what the scientists recommend, just based on pure data, and then some sort of a compromise with those who have some sort of economic interest, for instance, in that issue. And some people may have some ethical objections or moral objections as far as what the environmental scientists recommend. And then some sort of solution is generally a compromise between what science says and what other entities say. Sometimes it leans more towards the science, but more often than not, because of the way our government works and how laws are made and who is making those laws, which tend not to be the scientists or tend to be people with very little or no scientific background, unfortunately will favor business interests. Of a perspective here, early on when the first Europeans were here and then started to multiply, as far as environmental laws are concerned, it was just more of kind of take what you want, develop land, cities and towns, mining, extracting minerals. But it became apparent in the late 1800s and the mid 1900s that with human population growing, that more and more land was getting used and developed, and that we might want to set aside some of this land to preserve it. And so for mostly just for aesthetic and recreational purposes. So we say this is the time of aesthetic and recreational environmentalism. And so you have like the major part of these initiatives are just to set land aside. So this is where we see a lot with like the National Park Service being formed, the National Wildlife Refuge System, just wilderness preservation in general. But it became apparent, once you started hitting, you had much more industry occurring. You had human population growth exploding, cities getting bigger, much more manufacturing and industry and development. In the 1950s, especially after World War II, you had many more as a result of World War II, I should say, the invention of man-made chemicals like man-made chemical fertilizers, the invention of plastics, more and more manufacturing. We noticed that some of these things need to be regulated because there's a whole lot of pollution that was occurring or taking place. And so we found that the environmental laws that were formed were regulatory in response to all of this waste and all of this pollution. And this is where you find that you have most of the environmental laws were formed in the early 1960s to 1980. A lot of the laws and regulations that went into place. And in 1970, you see that, we made such a mess of the environment. You had Cuyahoga River in Ohio actually catch fire like 3 times because it was so polluted. And you might want to scroll through those pictures as far as what America looked like before the Environmental Protection Agency was formed in 1970. The place was it was a mess. I mean, not just litter everywhere, but water was too dirty to drink, rampant air pollution, because there were no laws regulating it before then. I mean, kind of hard to believe, but there weren't laws that had anything to say about this. And so, as far as the formation of the National Environmental Policy Act and the Environmental Protection Agency in 1970, it was nonpartisan, 73-0 in the Senate, the Clean Air Act in 1970. And Richard Nixon, Republican. Clean air, water, and open space have become a common cause of all people of this country. These should once again be the birthright of every American. Nobody argued about it. There was no issue about the environment. It was put front and center as far as a priority and a right to have clean air and clean water. So you saw, dozens of environmental regulatory laws be put into place, and including the Superfund Act, which is in a film that you'll watch this week about the event at Love Canal. That is, what to do about these extremely toxic sites that were the result of manufacturing and industry just dumping all of their effluents into the ground and into the water and essentially poisoning these areas and making them unfit for human habitation, and then just leaving because there was no oversight. There were no laws against it. And, what about the people that lived there? There were no laws protecting the people that brought in the Superfund Act of 1980. And then what happened? There were lots of other factors in the mid-1970s and the late 1970s as far as why the economy became stagnated. Lots and lots of factors. However, one of those that was somewhat exploited or kind of put into a different context was that, with these regulations, industries had to do things differently. They couldn't just dump all of their toxic crap into the water, into the air. They had to regulate that. They had to go through the steps to not do that, to not poison water, to not poison air, to not just dump all their crap into the ground. And they had to, that cost them some money to do so. And they had to be responsible. They had to clean up after themselves, right? And so they blamed these environmental regulations on the bad economy. Now, there were lots of reasons the economy was stagnant, but they blamed the environment for the economy. They had some industries moved overseas because in we don't call them really that anymore, third world countries had no environmental laws. The United States had environmental laws, so they'd move overseas and they'd blame the environmental regulations for people losing their jobs. And so they started making this link between environmental regulations and the overall economy. Ronald Reagan, when he ran for president in 1980, he used this front and center as far as his running platform, smaller government. dismantling environmental regulations because it harmed business. He pitted the economy against the environment, and he won based on this, and he did just that. President Carter in 1976 put solar panels on the White House. One of the first things Ronald Reagan did in 1980 when he got elected is he took down the solar panels because of the interests of the fossil fuel industry. So since then, environmental regulations have become a partisan issue with business pitted against the environment. Okay, so just as an aside, more and more we're realizing that environmentally positive initiatives like renewable energies are actually really positive for the economy and creates jobs. The last few years, we've backed the government that was in place over the last 4 years has gone back on that, and so now other countries are pretty much way ahead of us as far as renewable technology. But since then, unfortunately, it's like caring for the environment has become a liberal issue, and big business has become a conservative issue. And whenever one talks about environmental regulations, like immediately, like right away, it said, well, we're going to lose jobs. Can't do that. Can't do that. And so they're seen as intrusions, big government intrusions. And then, unfortunately, no longer being that partisan issue that it once was in the 1970s. You have, so, kind of bouncing off of that idea, there are those things, there are other things that you have to take into consideration as far as environmental policy is concerned, is that kind of switching gears a little bit here, that you do have to hold, environmental policy has to hold industry accountable. There are those that we refer to as free riders. So you have something put into place, some law put into place, and they benefit from all the resources of the public goods of the services, but they don't follow the rules and they don't pay for them. When reducing pollution is left to be voluntary, many cheat the system. So a policy has to be put into place, and you've all, and that's why it keeps being used as far as group projects. You've all worked on a group project. You have a group project, there's always going to be that one person who is a free rider and doesn't do anything, but still gets all the credit because somebody takes over for them. And what environmental policy strives to do is to make everybody accountable. Like, for instance, kind of an example, but when I do a group project, each person is in charge of one section and of the work, and if that one person doesn't do the section, they get a 0, and the other people in the group get what they deserve, the good grade, and that free rider doesn't benefit from everybody else's hard work. So that's a way that I eliminate free riders when I assign projects. But as far as environmental policy, you want to avoid free riders. External costs. Public policy forces private industry to bear the financial burden of polluting the environment, which was a problem before. So you could release toxins into a river if you're a paper company. You might think you're going to get away with it, but guess what? If you get caught, you're not only responsible for what you pollute or for that you polluted, but all of the damages to that ecosystem and to human health. You are also held responsible for that as well. As far as, there are lots of challenges to environmental policy making. It's not as easy as just the environmental, as I keep revisiting this, but environmental scientists coming up with their, analyzing their data and making recommendations, as far as then that being implemented or interpreted into the laws that are made. You have a lot working against that. Benny, please stop. Stop. You have market capitalism in the way that, if we live in a capitalistic society, and if it doesn't benefit business, this goes hand in hand with the next one with lobbying. If that environmental initiative or policy doesn't benefit that business, there are paid lobbyists who will sway the votes of those who are making the laws. It's in addition to that, there are campaign contributions. There are those who businesses who have their own interests in mind, who will donate millions to campaign contributions to politicians in order to get them to vote for the way they want to. You also have just human psychology, right? I mean, a lot of environmental issues and environmental problems are very big and take a long time in order to implement, in order to see any benefit from them. And so sometimes, when policies are being made, any policies, not just environmental policies, they want the immediate fix. They want the immediate benefits or solutions, immediate feedback right away. Whereas environmental problems, for instance, like global climate change, they take a very long time to see any gains from those laws that are put into place. And so sometimes people, they just don't see the immediate need for them if they're like long-term solutions. And then, most government officials are not scientists. Maybe the last science class they had was in high school. And so they might not even understand how science works. But, that's the benefit of the doubt. But generally, oh my goodness, hold on. But generally what you see is, you have people who are making these decisions who are also have their own business interests. So Andrew Wheeler was the head of the EPA, so the Environmental Protection Agency. Their task is to protect the environment, and the person who was put in charge was a coal lobbyist. He was a lawyer representing a coal magnate. And he was suing the Obama administration for their environmental policies. And he's the vice president of the Washington Coal Club. He was the person that they felt was the best person to be in charge of the Environmental Protection Agency. That is absurd. I mentioned previously, be careful, Aries is up on the door. I mentioned previously in the last lecture about Lamar Smith, the head of the House committee, who was received more money from the fossil fuel industry than anyone else. So, did he really know nothing about global climate change? Did he really think it was a conspiracy, or did he feel that he needed to say that because the fossil fuel industry actually paid for his elections? You have Dick Cheney. He was a U.S. vice president. He was a former CEO of Halliburton, which is an energy company that developed hydrofracking. And is it a coincidence then for the Safe Water Drinking Act that hydrofracking was the one thing that became exempt from the Safe Water Drinking Act? Because the U.S. president was a former CEO of Halliburton, the company that developed hydrofracking, he would say absolutely not, had nothing to do with it. But really? I mean, connecting those dots doesn't take too much effort. So very challenging, very challenging. We have an example here of environmental policy as far as laws, what the science says and what the economics say and what the ethics say. So here's an example of mercury. Mercury can be found natural, right, as a result of volcanic activity. But it is also prevalent it's extremely toxic. It's prevalent, gets into the environment through can you get him, please? Thank you. I'm sorry, Mr. Bang.
Santa must have seen Epstein's Island.
Oh, okay. But it gets into the environment through mining and the burning of coal. It's found naturally in the ground, and it's all right when it's in the ground, but boy, once it gets released into the environment and gets into living systems, it's extremely, extremely toxic. So therefore, scientists who study these things, environmental scientists, of course, they're going to say, remove as much anthropogenic, that's human-induced mercury emissions, as much as you can, as much as possible, because it is just so toxic to all living things. So what was proposed in 2008 was the Clean Air Mercury Rule. It was proposed to the EPA to reduce mercury emissions from power plants up to 70%. And then there is the Mercury and Air Toxic Standard in 2011, which applied to power plants and cement plants. From a scientist's point of view, that makes perfect sense. You have mercury that's getting into the environment, volcanic activity, very little. But when you have mining and burning of coal and cement plants putting it in the air, then you have put these rules into place to reduce the amount of emissions. Okay, so is it as easy as that? Here are the economics. So the cost to industries to install scrubbers to remove mercury from air is very high. All right. And instead of installing these scrubbers to reduce the amount of mercury before it was released into the air on these industries, many of these they just shut down instead of complying. And so, about $100,000 to $15 million per plant for upgrades. So a lot of the plants they just chose to shut down instead of putting the efforts into place for reduction of mercury released into the air. Charlie Dent, congressman, senator, I'm sorry, I don't remember. Anyway, those extreme voices, that is environmental activists, simply want to shut down the American cement industry and send those family-sustaining jobs overseas. Okay. Well, in my opinion, or I should say, from what I've observed, environmental activists and environmental scientists, they just wanted to reduce the amount of mercury in the environment for the sake of human health and the health of all living things. Shutting down capitalism, I don't think that was their goal, but nonetheless. Cost to health if not implemented. All right, so we have a lawyer here who's an environmental lawyer for Earth Justice, a lawyer for the EPA, James Pugh. My sister actually dated him. It's another story. Anyway, long time ago. What he says is it would cost $30 to $50 billion, 30 to 50 to prevent the following each year. So 960 to 2,500 premature deaths, 1,500 non-fatal heart attacks, 17,000 cases of aggravated asthma, and 130,000 lost days of work. So he kind of upped them and said, all right, so it costs the industries 100,000 to 15 million per plant for the upgrades, but it's going to cost our economy 30 to 50 billion dollars a year if we don't do this because of all of the health problems to humans. All right. And we get ethics involved here. Is allowing mercury to be released into the environment ethical to those communities? What if you live near one of these communities? Okay. And it's continuing to release mercury into the air because these aren't put into place. James Pugh, I think it's a shameful political decision by this administration to let people die and suffer unnecessarily. All right. So the EPA was sued by business. So the businesses sued the EPA for the clean air, the mercury rule, to remove mercury for the air. The Supreme Court in 2015, on a 5-4 judgment, they blocked the mercury rule due to cost of industry. And Justice Scalia said, one would not say that this is even rational, never mind appropriate, to impose billions of dollars in economic costs in return for a few dollars in health and environmental benefits. So basically it went to the Supreme Court, who struck down the mercury rule because it would cost billions of dollars in economic losses. Had nothing to do with human health. just said for a few dollars in health or environmental benefits. Okay. So, yeah, you know, a few people might die, might cost some money in health, but, you know, it matters more. Business matters more than human health and the health of the environment. Okay. Now, remember in 1970, it was Republican President Nixon who said, you know, hey, clean air and clean water is a right. This is a right that every American should have. So we compare it to that. So this is just an example of kind of where we are at this point, is that, you know, we're pitting the environment against the economy, and more often than not, business interests and economic interests win out. And that's my complaining. That's my my kvetching, my gretzing as far as environmental laws. I don't like this side of science, environmental science. I much prefer just learning about the ecology and what we can do about it, because it just gets ugly really fast and disheartening and unfortunate. And it's very complicated and complex. So, all right, well, that's it for now, and hope to see you soon. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.